So this video is going to be looking at the sources, talking about the outbreak of war, which is mainly going to be focusing on the Congress at Sparta, and then also the first few events of the war itself. So the first part of Thucydides that we're going to look at takes place at the Congress at Sparta. So we need to keep in mind that Thucydides would not have been present at this meeting because it was held in Sparta and he was an Athenian. So the speeches that he is relaying to us are either completely made up or he's heard them secondhand. And the problem with Thucydides is he doesn't tell us which is which. And some of the speeches later on in the source, well, in his book, he might have been present for, but again, we don't know which ones are which. So we have to keep this in mind that obviously Thucydides is not necessarily going to be giving us an entirely accurate version of events that's occurring. So this particular Congress of Sparta is occurring straight after the events that we looked at in the previous video around Aegina and Megara and Potidaea and Corcyra. So all of the Spartan allies have gathered together and envoys are sent on their behalf in order to discuss whether or not they're going to declare that the Treaty of 446 has been voided. So we're going to hear from different representatives. So the first one we're going to hear is from Corinth. Now remember, Corinth is the main instigator of the complaints at the Congress of Sparta. Obviously Potidaea had been was one of their colonies that had been targeted by Athens. They had felt put out by the fact that Corcyra had decided to ally with Athens. They thought they were Athens was getting involved in a dispute that they shouldn't have been getting involved in. So they're behind all these other allies kind of coming together because they've gone to Corinth first, and then the Corinth turns up and speaks to them. So we have part of the speech that the Corinthian envoy gives us, and it has some really quite strong criticisms of not only Athens but also of Sparta. So it sort of says at the very beginning of Spartans, what makes you somewhat reluctant to listen to us, others? So he points out here that Spartans are notoriously reluctant to go to war. And we know that from the Persian War. So if you remember the Battle of Marathon, Athens had sent for help and the Spartans could not come because there was a festival on, and they left once the festival was over. So the Spartans, despite having all this military training, tend to be quite reluctant to go to war and will only fight if they really have to. So this is one of the criticisms that Corinth is raising, that Sparta is taking far too long over this, that Athens has clearly broken the Treaty of 446 and needs to therefore be dealt with. You know, many times before now we have told you we are likely to suffer from Athens. You chose instead to suspect our motives and to consider that we were speaking only from our own grievances. So that's the issue they're saying, you've misread the situation. Athens is clearly a danger. You're doing nothing about it. And instead you sort of suggest that Corinth is trying to stir up trouble to sort of secure their own position. The result has been you did not call together this meeting of our allies before the damage was done. In other words, that Athens became far too powerful, and now the situation is 100 times worse than it had to be if we had just dealt with it quickly enough. Okay? We waited until now until we're actually suffering from it. So if you'd acted quicker, then we wouldn't be having to go to war. Which is interesting. So remember, in 440, the revolt of Samos, Sparta had wanted to go to war with Athens because they felt that Samos was being treated really unfairly. And it's actually Corinth who argues against it, saying, well, they're just Athenian allies and it's none of our business. They're not breaking the terms of the treaty. So within the last 6 years, Corinth has quite drastically changed their tune. So they've now gone from saying, no, don't go to war, to, why have you not gone to war before? And it's like, well, partly, Corinth, because you blocked the vote at the last Congress of Sparta. Short memories. So we have to complain of Athens and an insolent aggression of Sparta of her neglect of our advice. So Athens is going around attacking loads of places. It's beyond what the treaty has said. They're not just looking at their allies, they're attacking other places, which is partly true. Think about the Megaran decree. Megara was no longer an Athenian ally, and they were being targeted with this economic embargo and also these attacks on their land. So Corinth has a point here. The sheer action against Megara was very much breaking the terms of the treaty. So they're not wrong. They're not wrong. Just forgetting that they'd kind of stopped the war earlier. So it talks about how Athens has this aggression on the whole of Hellas, the whole of Greece. So Athens is, going everywhere and doing everything to everybody. Athens has deprived some states of their freedom and is scheming to do the same for others, especially among our own allies. So we have some quite nice treatment of ally quotes here, especially about the fact that Athens is kind of treating her own allies and other states really badly, and is also planning to take over the world. I'm not sure they were planning to take on the world, but you might disagree with me as we go through most of the war. And obviously, they're starting to attack Corinthian allies. So they're thinking about particularly Potidea, and that's what they were referring to. So it talks about, besieging Potidea, Potid's best possible ways for any campaign in Thrace, and Corcyra might have contributed a very large fleet to the Peloponnesian League. So it's pointing out the dangers of the fact that Sparta hasn't acted to this point, and this is kind of the situation that they've put themselves into. So now Athens has control of Potidea. They've got a really good camp in order to go and attack across Thrace, which is the top half of Greece. Well, near the top, of Greece. And then obviously Corcyra did have a fleet. That's the whole point of Athens joining with them. We should point out as well that Corinth was the main provider of the fleet for the Peloponnesian League, which is why they have this rivalry with Corcyra in the first place. And then they're blaming here is you are responsible for all of this. I'm pretty certain it's the Athenians responsible for all of this. But the point they're making in this section is the fact that Athens was able to get away with what they were doing because basically they didn't do anything about it. So you've got the Athenians fortifying the cities. Remember that was under Themistocles, who kind of hid the rebuilding of the walls away from the Spartan envoys after the Persian War. It talks about kind of that they're basically being enslaved by Athens, which is not true, but I guess it's a bit of I can't think of the right. I know the word I want to say. Of exaggeration. I'll go for that instead. To kind of also try and convince the Spartans and their other allies to fight with them. And it sort of says, you had this great reputation once being the liberator of Greece, and now you're letting Greece be taken over by Athens. Maybe a little bit harsh, but probably not true. Probably not wrong. And then it's saying, even at this meeting, there's still no definite proposals. You're just kind of like getting all these ideas, and you're still not doing anything about it. And he repeats the point that the Athenians are gradually encroaching on our neighbours, that it's not even doing it slowly, but they're just kind of like spreading their power everywhere. So this growth of Athenian power is obviously one of the major issues for us, a cause of conflict. Again, he's making the same point again and again. You do nothing in the early stages to prevent an enemy's expansion. He used to have the reputation of being safe, and sure enough, now one wonders whether this reputation was deserved. So they're hitting Sparta where it hurts the most, their military reputation, saying, you take too long, and you wait till it's really strong. So do you really deserve to be called like the saviours of Greece? Because I don't think you do anymore. The chief reason for the failure of the Persian invasion was the mistaken policy of the Persians themselves. So it wasn't down to you. It's actually because the Persians made some mistakes in the war, which is true. And they said, if we had managed to stand up to Athenian aggression, we could have done it because if Athens was making some mistakes, and we would have done it without you anyway. So we probably should have done something about it. Which, again, it's being a little bit harsh. We can think of instances already where those who relied on you and remain unprepared have been ruined by the confidence they placed in you. So they're kind of accusing Sparta basically not backing up their allies. So if you think of somewhere like Megara, which had essentially joined the Peloponnesian League and was now being forced into this kind of economic destruction by Athens, Sparta has not intervened at all. So there is a definite truth behind this. And they're also harking back to this idea of, that you didn't come and help Samos. But again, remember what I said earlier, that actually it was Corinth that blocked any action on Samos. But Sparta certainly does seem to be taking too long to do anything about it. They've not sort of checked Athenian power, and now look at the situation that we are now in. So Corinth finishes its speech, and then we have essentially the Athenian reply to this particular speech. So we have an Athenian representative, so he's an envoy, and he's talking to the Spartans and the other allies at the Congress at Sparta. So this guy is going to be defending Athenian behaviour quite strongly. So we did not gain this empire by force. It came to us at a time when you were unwilling to fight on to the end against the Persians. Our allies came to us of our own accord and begged us to lead them, which, to be fair to Athens, is true. So it was Athens who was going out and fighting in Cyprus and Egypt to push the Persians away from Greece. Obviously, Egypt's a little bit further, but you get my point. Sparta didn't come and do any of that. The Spartans very reluctantly came to Mycale to deal with that. So there's a fair point. There is a fair point here. And the allies of the Hellenic League, as it was, did ask Athens to take the leadership because Sparta did not want it anymore. So this is true. Obviously, at that time, it was an alliance, it wasn't an empire. But also to say we did not gain this empire by force is somewhat untrue, because you know that obviously when any allies were trying to leave the Delian League, they were forced back in again through violence. So it's a half-truth with a lot of truth coming afterwards. So it talks about the reason why the Delian League was formed. So the fear of Persia was our chief motive. That is true. Afterwards, we thought to of our own honour and of our interest. Generally happens when you're in an alliance. There came a time when we were surrounded by enemies. Yeah, true. That's true. There are other states that don't like Athens, like Corinth. You had lost the friendly feelings you used to have for us and turned against us. So you could link to that the behaviour of the Spartans during the Helot revolt and the fact that the Athenians were sent away. And obviously that is kind of seen as the point when Athens and Sparta completely fall out. So that would be their like, well, you turned your backs on us. So why are you so angry with us? You hate us anyway. And it was clearly no longer safe to risk letting our empire go. So in other words, this empire was protecting us because of the tribute, because of the ships, because of the men, etc. So if we let it go, we'd be really vulnerable and therefore would be in a really dangerous situation, especially as the allies go over to you. It's the opposite leagues, of course they did. But again, I think to be fair to Athens, they have some really good points here in defence of their behaviour. So, Spartans, your leadership of the Peloponnese have arranged the affairs of various states as to suit yourselves. So they are suggesting that Sparta is promoting oligarchies over democracy. Partly true, Sparta would promote oligarchies over democracy, but it's not true of all states. So states like Argos, for example, who did join the Peloponnesian League, initially were a democracy, and it's much later that they are eventually forced to become an oligarchy, which I will explain in future lessons. So not every state within the Peloponnesian League is an oligarchy. There are democracies within it, and also remember the Congress itself is democratic in nature. So the Allies and the Spartans have to agree. It's not just the Spartans telling everybody what to do. So this is not entirely true yet again. So, we have done nothing extraordinary. You were kind of killing lots of city-states, but okay. 3 very powerful motives prevent us from doing so. Sorry. I was like, what? Doing so, there we go. Security, honour and self-interest. We're not the first to act in this way. There's always been a rule that the weak should be subject to the strong. So, it's not our fault. It wasn't us first. The Hellenic League was formed first, so they're not wrong. But there's a really nice quote here about Athenian attitudes to their alliance. The weak should be subject to the strong. The Athenians are strong, therefore we have every right to tell the other allies what to do because we are better than them. Which is basically what this whole section is reiterating quite a few different ways. So that's why I've skipped over it. And then it kind of talks about how they weren't controlling their allies completely. And one of the reasons given against Athens for controlling their allies is the fact they said, you have to have their court cases have to come to Athens, which is true, they did. And the Athenians are defending this, saying we arrange such cases tried by impartial courts in Athens. Of course they're impartial. Our subjects, on the other hand, are used to being treated as equal. So, in the court cases, they are treated as equal. They come give evidence. There is judgments being made, and the power of our empire allows us to do so. The fact that when these trials went to Athens, they had to pay a tax to do so is neither here nor there, and obviously is clearly left out by the Athenian representative. But, take from that what you want. There's another nice quote about the treatment of allies. So the weak must give in to the strong. So in other words, the Athenians have every right to do what they want to do. Certainly put up with much worse sufferings than this one under the Persians. So yes, we might be a bit horrible, but it was worse under Persia. They think our government is oppressive. And so that is natural enough because subject peoples always find present time most hard to bear. And saying, we think back in time when you were under the Persian rule, it was much worse than we are. And again, elements of that are true. Obviously, the Ionian states initially under Persia were forced to have tyrants. But we also know that after the Ionian revolt, the Persians had realised that the tyrants were making some real problems for them. So they allowed Mardonius to set up a load of democracies across the Ionian states. So that's not entirely true. We also know that the Persian tribute was assessed quite fairly and was never a horrific amount of money. While obviously the Athenians initially, under Aristides, the tribute was set up very fairly, but after Aristides' death and the other generals that come in after and reassess the tribute, it does climb very quickly. So the idea that the Athenians were treating their allies better than the Persians had treated the same states, again, is a half-truth. They're being very selective, as you would expect them to be, with their evidence. But it gives you, this particular section of the speech, a really good indication of how Athens saw themselves at the head of the empire. We are the strongest, we can do what we like, you can't tell us what to do. We then have a Spartan ephor. So the ephors are the council that advises the king. So this is one of the ephors speaking. And they're kind of basically summarising the arguments that are brought together and sort of going to then give some kind of instruction to the Congress and to the Spartans. So I don't understand these long speeches the Athenians make. Yeah, I mean, the Athenians were known for their rhetoric and their oratory skills, and the Spartans speak quite simply and get to the point. So he's like, I don't really understand what they're saying. But he has obviously understood it enough that they made no attempt to contradict the fact they are acting aggressively against our allies and against the Peloponnese. So, and that's true, because in here we've heard absolutely no defence of their behaviour towards Potidaea, for example. Then there's a few kind of like digs at Athens. They were once good, now they've turned out bad. We shall not allow any aggression against our allies. We'll talk about Megara and a few other places. Do not allow the Athenians to grow still stronger. This bit in here talks about whether or not the allies were able to come and help. Offers offered money and ships and horses. Actually, I'll highlight that because that's quite handy. Hang on, I'm just reading that all the way through. So there we go. So they would expect their allies to help them out in the war, obviously, because that's the whole point of being an ally. So I'm just fiddling with that. There we go. And it's pointing out as well that Athens is gaining lots of money and ships and horses from their allies. But just because they have good resources does not mean that we shouldn't act against the Athenians. And that's what this section is basically talking about. And Spartans, cast your votes for the honour of Sparta in war. Do not let Athenians grow stronger. So this ephor is very much pro-war. So then, it's a very short speech compared to the Athenians. Like I said, the Spartans tend to speak more simply. So the speech is then given, and then the question is then put to the Spartan assembly. So remember, there's going to be, when it says the Spartan assembly, it means the Congress at Sparta. So the Spartans that are there give a vote by acclamation. So that means they elected the shout. It's called the shout. So they would be like, yes, no, whatever. And initially they couldn't figure out what was going on. So they wanted them to show their opinions more openly, so they had to shout a bit louder. So he changes the question slightly. So Spartans, those of you who think the treaty has been broken and Athenians are the aggressor, get up and stand on one side. So he gets them literally to move instead of just shouting, and the great majority were of the opinion that the treaty had been broken. So it's now declared at this particular point by the Spartans that, 446 BC, that treaty is dead. Athens has broken it quite considerably. I mean, if you're talking about the alliance of Corcyra, sort of breaking it, but not. The actions against Potidaea, well, they were an ally, so not, but definitely the action against Megara very much does break the treaty, so that's an understandable decision that has been made. So they summoned their allies to the assembly and told them they decided that was acting aggressively. Sorry, there we go. But they wanted to have their allies with them, so they put to the vote. Well, they have to because Congress of Sparta, and it should be done on a unanimous resolution. So all the allies have to agree, basically, for this decision to hold. So then they all kind of vote, and then the decision of the assembly is the treaty had been broken. So it is done. They are now officially at war. So this is now the start of the Second Peloponnesian War in 431. So then this section of Thucydides talks further. It gives, again, his key argument for why the war happened, because the Spartans were afraid of the further growth of Athenian power. We've talked about this before. That's what he sees as the key reason behind the war. Later on, we skip a bit of the source, and we have the Corinthian representative again speaking. Sorry, I don't know why I didn't put that in bold. Put it in bold, be consistent. So again, it's kind of justifying what we can do, their reasons for it. So we're the victims of aggression. Yeah, partly true. And then he's going to sort of buoy up the their forces in order to say it's not a lost cause. So, first it was superior numbers and in military experience, because they have Sparta. As a sea power, the Athenians are strong. And they will build up, the Peloponnesians will build up from the existing resources of our alliance, so basically the Corinthian navy, and they can also use some funds. They can borrow money from Olympia and Delphi in order to basically kind of attract the foreign soldiers, sailors, who rowed the boats for the Athenian navy. The Athenian navy was quite reliant on these mercenaries, and some foreigners known as metics. And they would pay them quite good money to row the boats for them. So they're saying, if we offer these guys high pay, we can get the better rowers. And it says, the power of Athens rests on mercenaries rather than her own citizens. That is true. They require money to carry out these projects, and we will contribute money. So the Peloponnesian League agrees basically to have a form of tribute system, but not to the same extent as the Athenians, in order to pay for the war, because it's going to be expensive. Because they basically know that the war against Athens is going to take a really long time. Now, I should point out, we'll take a pause in this section. You don't have the source section which goes through this, but I will explain it to you anyway. So at the Congress at Sparta, oh, sorry, my cat's trying to climb my lap and put me off. There we go. The king of Sparta, a guy called Archidamus, who will speak later, if I find him. Here we go. So King Archidamus here, this guy. So he's the king of Sparta. So he went to the Congress of Sparta, and he actually argues against going to war at this particular point. Now, he doesn't argue against the war in general. He agrees that the Athenians have been aggressive, etc., etc., etc. But he points out that the war itself will take forever, and he's not wrong. He sort of says, the Athenian power is really great, that they have all these resources, they have all these allies, they've got all these kind of ships, they've got money, they've got everything. And, the Spartans don't have any of this stuff. And he argues, essentially, that they should wait, build up our resources, and then we can fight the Athenians more evenly. So if we go to war now, it's going to take far too long, and we will kind of exhaust ourselves, and it will be kind of like, we will eventually win, but it will take a really, really long time. And this is essentially what this Corinthian speech is arguing against. I don't know why the example took the Archidamus bit out, because it's a really good speech showing the Spartan reluctance. However, you don't have that, but you can have that as contextual knowledge, and it is in Thucydides. So if you want to reference what I have said and sort of say Thucydides talks about how Archidamus argues against the war, that will counter source evidence. It's perfectly valid. It's completely correct. As I said, I've been teaching this stuff for donkey's years. It's sort of in this middle section that they have cut out, which is a little bit frustrating. So that was just an aside to explain why Corinth is making these particular arguments. Hence why I'm saying we can borrow money, we can do this, we could be fine. The Corinthian representative goes on to say, we can foster revolts amongst their allies, so we can stir up problems within the allies, and this is the best means of depriving of the revenues on which their strength depends. So this is a really good quote for the treatment of allies, sort of the Athenians seeing their allies as a source of wealth and resources. Sorry, my nose has gone really blocked and I can't breathe properly. So that's quite handy for that. And it also shows like sort of allies causing conflict. You got Corinth kind of like going around stirring up problems, but it's Corinth. Corinth is what Corinth does best. And he also points out that Athens is so much stronger than any single state in our alliance. True, because they have the land army, and they have the navy, and therefore the allies, and they have money and trade and a long wall. So yes, they are incredibly strong. And he says, she's capable of standing up to all together. So he sort of says, unless we go to war with not only full force, but every city and every nationality. So we can probably highlight that to show the importance of allies as well as for as a resource for the Spartans. So that's quite a handy quote. There's not many Spartan quotes that we can find. And he's saying, normally to the Spartans this would be like really sort of embarrassing, but actually, needs must, and the only way we're going to be able to defeat the Athenians is if we kind of work together. And again, another dig at Athens, calling it a dictator state to be in Hellas. He's pointing out the Athenian democracy is democracy is a really stupid thing to say, and Athens kind of sort of says to Greece, oh yes, we're democratic and we're wonderful, we're a beautiful place, come study our ways. But actually, in terms of treating their other allies, they're really unpleasant and like quite tyrannical. Well, not quite tyrannical, they're tyrannical because we've been looking at it recently. And that's why, we made it a principle to put down such despots. It's our job to put down the Athenians because they are basically being horrible to Greece. So that is a nice summary of the events leading up to the Congress of Sparta and then the Congress of Sparta itself. So that is the outbreak of war. So then we have what's called the Archidamian War. So in the Peloponnesian War, it breaks down into a few different sections, and I'm going to type them into here, and then you can write it if you want to. So we have the first Peloponnesian War, which we have obviously done. Can't type. There we go. First Peloponnesian War, which had run from 460 to 446 BC, with a peace treaty in the middle. Well, in the middle for about 5 years. We then have the second Peloponnesian War, which I can't spell clearly. Peloponnesian War. Okay. Now the whole war itself runs through. Hang on. Yeah, sorry. Runs through to about 403 BC, but it breaks down into subsections. So we have what's called the Archidamian War. Archidamian War. Actually, it says there the dates. I'm just going to type it again anyway. Oh my dear lord. There we go. 431 to. Well, it says 420. It's about 421-ish. We then have a peace for a bit, which is quite nice. Not for very long, I should point out, but we have a bit of a peace. And then the war breaks into another section in 415. Sorry. We have what's known as the Ionian War, which is about 415 to 404-ish BC. And like I said, there's this middle section which is kind of peace, and then the peace breaks down. I should put that in. So then we have peace from around about 421 to about about 418-ish BC. Ish. Okay, like I said, it's not a long peace, but it was supposed to last 50 years, and it lasts technically about 3 months, but it goes on for about 3 years. And then we have the Ionian War. So all of these come under what's called the Second Peloponnesian War. Now, in all honesty, you can call the whole lot the Peloponnesian War. The exam board is not going to particularly care. What is important are some of these key dates. So if it talks about the Peloponnesian War in 431, you need to be aware of the events that happened in this section of the war, not in the whole war. If it mentions the First Peloponnesian War, you've got to remember it's talking about up until the Peace Treaty 446. And it will highly unlikely talk about the Archidamian War specifically, but it might do. But it will certainly bring you up to certain key dates like 421 BC. Now, if you're curious of why it's called the Archidamian War, it's because this section of the war is named after the king of Sparta, which is King Archidamos. So the nickname comes from that. And also a lot of it took place around the Attica lands of Athens. So it's really land-based, it's not very naval at this particular point. The naval war comes in the Ionian War later on. So if you want to make a note of that, you can. Doesn't really matter. It gives you a rough idea of where we're going. So we've done this bit. We're now doing the outbreak of the war. We've done the interwar period, and we're now working through this first. We're going to work through this bit in the next couple of lessons. Okay. So we then have Thucydides talking about the outbreak of the Archidamian War. So it talks about how both sides put everything into the war effort, so they prepare themselves really strongly. There's great enthusiasm. They're recruiting lots of people, etc., etc. I've highlighted this because it kind of shows you one of the problems that we have with Thucydides, that there are some all kinds of prophecies and kinds of oraclear utterances being made in both the cities. So there were oracles kind of going, oh, look at this, look at that. Like the moon. And it says about an earthquake in Delos, and there'd never been an earthquake before, and these are all signs that the war was coming and it was all going to be terrible. So even Thucydides, who writes or tries to write in quite a scientific, measured way, does mention oracles, like all these ancient sources do. It's a sign of impending events and so on and so forth. What we do have is showing that a lot of Greece was on the side of the Spartans, because the Spartans, and this is the really important bit, in fact I will highlight this in a different colour, because this is going to be an important point much later in the course. says that their aim was the liberation of Hellas. So Sparta goes into the war saying we're going to free Greece of Athenian control. Like I said, this is going to come back to us later in the war. So it's an important thing, hence why I am highlighting it. If you can box it or whatever, it'd be a really important thing to do so. And everyone hates Athens, hence why they're able to say this. So then we have the king Archidamus. So he gives this speech essentially after the ephors kind of say, go to war, everyone votes. And he's kind of sort of trying to, despite the fact he doesn't really want to go to war, buoying up their situation. So we're greater in numbers and greater in spirit than ever before, because the city we're moving against the height of her power. So it shows kind of the importance of the allies and the tribute to the Athenians. The whole of Hellas is eagerly watching this action of ours because of the general hatred against Athens. That's just reiterating this point up here. And then it talks about basically the war plan that the Spartans are going to do. It's not a very good war plan, I will point out. Now, in here, it's talking about how Athens is not going to come out and meet us in battle because they know we're stronger, which is true. The Athenians will avoid fighting the Spartans one-on-one if they can possibly help it, because they know the Spartans are going to be more superior on a land battle. So, what the Athenians basically decide to do, and it will mention it down here, is they pull everybody in behind the long walls of Athens. Not like all our allies, because that'd be mad, but the Attica lands that surround Athens, the farmlands, they pull everybody in behind the long walls to protect them. But it does mean that the farms and the farmlands are therefore exposed. So Archidamus is pointing out here, look, the Athenians aren't going to come out and fight us because they pulled themselves behind the long walls. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into their country and lay waste and destroy their property. And that is quite literally the war plan of the Spartans. The Athenians won't fight. Pericles, who is basically the lead general at this time, sort of goes, nah, not going to fight. The Spartans not going to win. So they're going to wait it out. And the Spartans, every year, come into Attica, destroy the farmland, and then go home again. And that is it. And that is basically the first couple of years of the Peloponnesian War after 431. Nothing really happens other than people burn stuff and then they go home again. The idea is they're going to try and starve the Athenians out. Now, the Spartans themselves don't want to besiege Athens because they know they're not very good at it, and they know the Athenians are much better at it. This obviously does not take into account that the Athenians have a port, which is also behind the long walls. It goes around Athens to say Athens is here. They've got these long walls down to their port. But that is going to come and be a problem later on. So the Spartan plan is, if I'm honest, not very good. And to be fair, the Athenian plan's not very good, because if you set everyone behind his walls, inevitably there's going to be disease, which we'll come back to later. So, anyway, the Peloponnesian are kind of basically get everyone their troops together, and then we have Pericles. So he is one of the 10 generals. I will highlight that just so you remember who he is. We've met him before. Remember, he was in the First Peloponnesian War, and he was the rival of Simon. So when Simon died, Pericles comes to prominence and is very powerful. I will remind you that everything that happens in the Athenian democracy has to go through the People's Assembly first. Everything has to be voted on by the Assembly. So it's not like Pericles comes in and goes, we're going to do this, and everyone just goes, oh, okay, and then and that's it. He doesn't make the decisions himself. Everything he does has to go through the People's Assembly. However, the sources like to point out that Pericles was very, very powerful because he was a very good orator. So he gave very good speeches, and the sources quite like him because of this particular fact. That and his plan of just kind of waiting it out kind of had an element of good idea about it, except for, disease. So he comes forward and gives a speech to the Athenians in the assembly, and he's aware that he needs to pull everyone behind the long walls, but he might be accused of kind of trying to protect his own lands. So he sort of says, okay, because he thinks the Spartans, because remember Pericles had quite a good relationship with the Spartan king. Because remember, according to Thucydides, Pericles, or was it Plutarch, one of the two, Pericles might have been bribing the Spartan king not to invade during the peace treaty period. So he's aware of this rumour that people might distrust Pericles because Archidamus is his friend. So he says, right, look, he's got land in Attica as well, so he proposes to give them up and make them public property. So that way, he doesn't gain any from the estate. So even if they're left alone, it doesn't matter because they are now the property of the Athenians. And then you have the war plan. So he brings in the city their property from the country. They're not to go out and off for battle because they know they won't win. And basically he sort of says, the strength of Athens come from the money paid in by the tribute of allies. So again, allies are source of wealth, really helpful for treatment of allies questions. And he points out that there's yearly contributions from the allies, it amounts to 600 talents, which is a lot of money. And then he goes through the fact they've got loads of other money. So they've got 6,000 talents in silver. They've got a reserve fund of about 9,700. I mean, it's used to pay for a few buildings, but essentially they've got a lot of money left over. They gained some spoils from the Persian War of about sort of no less than 500 talents. They've got money from temples they can use if necessary. If they really have to, they can kind of take the gold off the statue of Athena, which is like a huge statue in the Parthenon. And essentially, they can fund their war quite easily. It's not a big issue. They can keep trading through the port. He also points out that they have 1,300 hoplites and another 16,000 in other garrisons. So they're well protected. So they can protect the long walls. So we've got the wall of Pharalaeum, runs for 4 miles from the city to the city circuit. So the so the edge of the city. And nearly 5 miles of the wall surrounding the city was guarded, so it's not like the Spartans can just jump over the wall, they'll be fine. They've got 4.5 miles of long walls down to Piraeus. They've also got 1,200 cavalry, bowmen, 1,600 bowmen, other bowmen, sorry. So these guys are on horses, these guys are not. They have 300 triremes all ready to go. So they're really super strong, ready to go. We can wait it out, we'll be absolutely fine. Okay? So far, so good. He then gives a bit more of the speech. Yes, a bit later on, sorry. And again, it's kind of showing the Athenians why they should be fighting and protecting themselves. Basically, why should we not give in and why we should not fight in inverted commas the the Spartans. So, to support the imperial dignity of Athens, this again is all about Athenian imperialism. It's quite handy quotes for this. This involved the loss of our empire and the hatred we incurred from administering it. Administering. I give up. So what we do have is the idea that clearly shown there's been some unfair treatment of allies, is my point. Fantastic quote, which we'll use probably quite a lot. Your empire is now like a tyranny. It is certainly dangerous to let it go. So they are acknowledging, or Pericles is acknowledging, that the treatment of allies has been pretty bad. And if they sort of let it go, all these allies are going to gang up on them and kill them, which is probably true. Okay? And he gives this speech because they're really, really angry with them. Now, the reason why they're angry with them in 2.65 is because all their land has been destroyed by the Spartans. So it's been like a year's gap between these different events in the sources being talked about. And the farmers and everyone else, understandably, are very upset because they've lost their estates. And there's varying plagues going around. And the Athenians are really, really suffering, as you would expect when you bring in the entire population of your city behind the walls. So he gives this speech of our empire's really important, because he's trying to kind of make sure the Athenians are not angry with him, and as distraction from their immediate sufferings. Now, I will point out that you're missing a chunk here, which is another part of his speech. Now, what was I going to read? Some of the I'm trying to think how I'm going to explain this next section to you, because at the moment it's not particularly relevant. So this section here, if I just highlight it briefly, which is this, for our section in terms of section A and the Peloponnesian War, it's not massively helpful. It's really handy for section B when we're talking about political leaders in the Athenian democracy, because it gives you a really nice description of the power and the abilities of Pericles, which is really, really important later on when we do that last section. So in your source book, if you could annotate next to this for use in section B as well, be really helpful, because this is like a gold mine of quotes for this particular topic that we would be doing. We do have to talk about in section A the effects of conflict, and one of those effects can be political effects of conflict. Now, one of the effects of conflict for Athens, in terms of politics, if I just create a gap, is something called the rise of demagogues. So, political effect. Rise of Oh, I spelled that wrong. Demagogues. There we go. So demagogues are basically politicians, politicians who use, sorry, I can't type and think, rhetoric to control the people. Okay, and we will look at this in a lot more detail. So basically, the problem with demagogues is it's people manipulating people in order to have power and do whatever they want to do, which you could argue is not particularly democratic, because obviously, although the Athenians are voting for this legislation and war policy and all the rest of it to be passed, it is being voted on due to the result of rhetoric and manipulation by key leaders. Now, Pericles is not the first demagogue. We actually looked at one when we looked at Themistocles. Remember, Themistocles told a lie in order to get the navy built. So it's not a new phenomenon. However, during the Second Peloponnesian War, it becomes a massive issue. So Pericles is probably the first really powerful demagogue in the Athenian democracy. And then the second half of this source here talks about the problems with demagogues as a whole. So it's not necessarily massively helpful for Section 8, except in the context of this, of a political effect. So it's kind of showing that the democracy wasn't working as properly as it should do, because there were these key individuals who became really powerful through the use of rhetoric. Now, I will point out that Pericles was generally really liked by the sources because he was aristocratic and seemed to be doing things for the right reason. So he was using this manipulation for the good of the city. And the others that came after him are not from the same, generally, oh no, one of them is not from the same background and is really disliked by the sources, which we'll talk about later. And there are others who are similar in Pericles but have a bit more private ambition. So we do have this idea that demagogues start to become more powerful and democracy is reduced as a result of it. However, a counter-argument to all of this is the fact that the demagogues still had to go to the assembly to pass the legislation or the proposals or whatever. Yes, they use rhetoric, but ultimately it is still the people who have to make these decisions, which is showing here. So Pericles, people were angry with him because of obviously the land was being destroyed, but they still fine him. So it's not like Pericles has complete control here. The people are still able to chastise him and tell him he's done the wrong thing. They don't get rid of him. They re-elect him to the generalship, but they're unhappy and they're willing to let themselves have this shown. So there is this element of like the people were still controlling the demagogue. So maybe democracy was still working. So there's a whole argument within that, and hopefully that made some sort of sense. But that's why it's saying they put all their affairs into his hands. So according to Thucydides, Pericles takes control of the democracy. Not true. He still had to get everything passed. The Megarian Decree was passed by the assembly, as an example. So it wasn't like he controlled everything, because it's just not true. They do regard Pericles as the best man they had, and it says when Pericles at the head of affairs, the state was widely led and firmly guarded. Yeah, Athens, it is known as the Golden Age of Athens, is the Periclean Golden Age. So he did some fantastic building works, which again we'll look in section B. He sort of did some democratic reforms, which made things a bit better. So he was good. I'm not saying that Pericles was a bad guy. He was a good person, or seems to come across as a really good person. But just don't be fooled by the fact that the sources love him, because they absolutely adore him, because they think he's amazing. Not helped by the fact that Thucydides is a particular fan of Pericles and thought he was just like the bee's knees. Don't write that in an essay. So and then there's some more things about why Pericles is amazing. So he appears to have accurately estimated the power of Athens was. For Pericles, it said if Athens would be victorious if they bided her time and took care of her navy. That is the point of hiding behind the long walls. If she avoided trying to add to the empire during the course of the war. So don't go and expand it if you don't have to. However, it points out in a section that the successors did the complete opposite. So this in particular is referring to the actions of two people. This is referring to the actions of, I will put it in, oh no I won't, hang on. What am I trying to do? That's what I was trying to do. So it's referring to the actions of a gentleman called Cleon. And it is also referring to someone called Alcibiades in particular. we'll come to them when we do them. So he criticises private ambition and private profit-led policies are bad for the Athenians and themselves and their allies. That is mainly a dig at Cleon, to be completely honest. We have another really handy quote for section B. It was he who led them rather than they who led him. So that's talking about Pericles. So he was fantastic. It tells you his opinions on Pericles here. I should have pointed out. Pericles' position, his intelligence, his known integrity, could respect the liberty of the people at the same time hold them in check. Because he's just Pericles. He's just fantastic. Hence why he's had so much power. So much so that what was normally a democracy power was really in the hands of the first citizen. So that's Pericles again. And then it talks about his successors. So this is Cleon, Alcibiades, and a few others who were more on a level with each other and whom aimed at occupying the first place. Adopted methods of demagogy, which is being a demagogue. We will highlight that, resulting in a losing control over the actual conduct of affairs. So if you want to do like a political effect of the war, is you've got the rise of demagogues in Athens, and it causes problems in terms of the war itself. So it talks about it led to a number of mistakes, such as the Sicilian expedition, which you don't know what that is at the moment, and we will be doing that not too long away, actually, to be honest. We'll talk about it at the time, but it's a handy one to highlight at the moment. They were so busy with their own personal intrigues for securing the leadership of the people, so that's why they were kind of like doing the wrong things of the war. So again, these are all kind of effects of conflict. You need sort of political effects leading to military effects. And again, it talks about revolution breaking out in Athens. Again, you don't know what that's referring to, and I'm not going to tell you what it means yet, but when we do it, it will make sense. So that will be a really handy quote, I promise, later on in the course to do with the Peloponnesian War. And that's what this, and then it talks about the fact that, I will highlight this as well. Bit of a spoiler alert, Persia becomes involved and provides the Spartans with money for the fleets. Again, you don't know the context of this, but I will get to highlight it because it's a really useful quote later on. Anything about Sparta getting money or allies is always handy to highlight. And then he kind of says, this is the issues that Pericles had in mind when he prophesies an easy victory if they had just stayed behind their long walls in the long run. Whew, long video. Sorry about that. Didn't help with me kind of giving you a little bit of extra information, but hopefully that information will really help you with essays, etc. And that is the end of this particular topic, because obviously thus we're going on to the effects of conflict.
So this section of Thucydides just gives you just a couple of things when talking about the effects of the plague. So the actual plague section of Thucydides is really, really long. So I've just literally taken this tiny little bit from this section and just picked out a few sentences. So when you're talking about the effects of conflict and you want to talk about the plague and you want to put some source evidence in, these are the three things I would talk about. So we have the idea that we have the bodies of dying heaped on top of each other. So many people were dying that they literally just like dropping dead in the streets. And they're just kind of piling on top of each other, which is really gross. We've also got this kind of really quite vivid description about these kind of people staggering around looking for water because they desperately wanted water. It's this desire for war, I should say water. We also have the fact that religion and law starts to be ignored because everybody's dying, so what's the point of following the law? What's the point of worshipping the gods? And Thucydides says basically because of the plague, this begins a state of unprecedented lawlessness. So society starts to fall apart. And although I didn't highlight it, it's a couple of things, examples. They spend their money really quickly and they spend it on pleasurable things like, alcohol and women and what have you, because there's no point, everybody's dying anyway, and it just kind of shows the real impact and chaos that was caused by the plague after the outbreak of the war.